this video continues in Revelation. We're in chapter 9. We've been looking at the trumpet judgments, and this will be the fifth one at verse 1. We'll just go ahead and jump into it. It's very complicated at times, but we'll do the best we can to try to understand it and not add anything to it. It says, "The fifth angel sounded his trumpet, and I saw a star that had fallen from the sky to the earth." Now this star is a reference to an angel that has fallen, and we know this to be Satan. Jesus referred to it. Later on in Revelation chapter 12, it's going to mention this. Isaiah and Ezekiel both refer to this falling of Satan. And it says the star was given the key to the shaft of the abyss. So he's given the authority to allow demons to come out of hell and to have a great influence on the earth at this time. It says when he opened the abyss, this word in the Greek is from the word bottomless pit. When he opened the abyss, the bottomless pit, smoke rose from it like smoke from a gigantic furnace. So you can almost imagine this evil presence moving across the earth at this time. It says the sun and the sky were darkened by the smoke of the abyss, and out of the smoke locusts came down upon the earth and were given power like that of the scorpions of the earth. And John's doing the best he can to explain this. You're going to see the word "like" several times throughout this chapter. He's explaining something that he sees, but he's coming to us from 2,000 years ago, so he's trying to explain it, and he says it looks like a scorpion, but he's not quite sure. And many have said this may be helicopters, it may be the influence of mankind from demonic oppression, but it's kind of hard to understand for sure what he's saying, other than there is a movement of evil across the earth. And we'll go on to verse 4. They were told not to harm the grass, the earth, the plant, or the tree, but only those people who did not have the seal of God on their forehead. So now Ephesians talks about a seal that's placed on the Christian or the believer when we give our lives to God. We are sealed into salvation. It talks about this in Ephesians 1 and 13 and in other places. So this seal, there's even a reference to it in Ezekiel chapter 9 where Ezekiel was told to go and put a mark on their head. But these folks that are being punished are those that do not have the seal, those people that have not come to salvation in the tribulation period, people that will not admit that God is the one true God, that Jesus is the Messiah, and those that don't have the seal of God on their forehead, they are receiving punishments. They have been given their authority for Satan to pretty much rule over them. And it says in verse 5, they were not given power to kill them, so this demonic oppression is not able to kill them, but to torture them for about 5 months. And the agony they suffered was like the sting of a scorpion. Again, he's doing the best he can to explain what he sees in this vision when it strikes a man. Verse 6, during those days men will seek death, but they will not be able to find it. They will long to die, but death will elude them. This sounds a lot like what Job experienced when he was experiencing such pain, and he wanted to die, but that wasn't the purpose of God to allow him to die, so he kept Satan from being able to kill him. He said, you can take these things away, but you can't take his life. I believe Satan is being limited in his ability to kill, but he is able to cause havoc on the earth at this time. So there's going to be great struggle on the earth during this fifth trumpet, but they won't be able to kill mankind because God is still trying to give mankind a chance to repent. And then in verse 7 it says, the locusts looked like horses prepared for battle. On their heads they wore something like crowns of gold, and their faces resembled human faces. And their hair was like women's hair, and their teeth were like lions' teeth. And they had breastplates like breastplates of iron, and the sound of their wings were like thundering of many horses and chariots rushing into battle. And they had tails and stingers like scorpions, and in their tails they had the power to torment people for 5 months. And they had a king over them, the angel of the abyss. whose name in Hebrew is Abaddon, and in Greek, Apollon, which means destroyer. Now, when you go back to Joel chapter 2 in the Old Testament, there's a description of these locusts prophesied by the prophet Joel years before Jesus was even brought to the earth. It says in Joel chapter 2, "Blow the trumpet in Zion, sound the alarm on the holy hill. Let all who live on the land tremble, for the day of the Lord is coming. It is close at hand, a day of darkness and gloom, a day of clouds and blackness. Like dawn spreading across the mountains, a large and mighty army comes, such as never was of old, nor ever will be in ages to come. Before them fire devours." It goes on, it says, "They have the appearance of horses, and they gallop along like cavalry, with a noise like that of chariots, and they leap over mountaintops like a crackling fire, consuming stubble like a mighty army drawn up for battle." At verse 8 it says, "At the sight of them nations will be in anguish, and every face will turn pale. They charge like warriors, they scale walls like soldiers. They all march in line, not swerving from their course." So they have one purpose, and that is to kill, most likely Israel. And verse 8, "They do not jostle each other, each marches straight ahead. They plunge through defenses without breaking ranks, and they rush upon the city." Verse 10 says, "Before them the earth shakes, the sky trembles, the sun and moon are darkened." I mean, there's so many coming toward Israel, I believe, and the stars, they're not even able to see them. And then finally it gets to the point of this battle that's coming. Verse 12 in Joel 2 says, "Even now declares the Lord, return to me with all your heart, with fasting and weeping and mourning. Rend your heart." That means be humble. Be humble in your heart. Don't rip your garments, but make your heart change. Return to the Lord your God. Finally, in verse 15 of that passage, it says, "Blow the trumpet in Zion, declare a holy fast, call a sacred assembly, gather the people, consecrate the assembly, bring together the elders." So this is talking about in Joel, I believe, the same thing that this is talking about. You've got a demonic army that is influenced by these demons that have come up out of the abyss, that are going to be pressed toward Israel to take them down. I mean, that's going to be the main army of Satan, and it's going to be the main enemy of Satan will be Israel. So this is talking about a war to come. It may not be Armageddon. It may be the battle of Gog and Magog, which we'll talk about shortly, but this is definitely a large-scale war that will take place during those 7-year tribulation. So continuing in Revelation 9, and now we're in verse 12, it says, "The first woe is past," and this truly is a sad state for the world. You've got an army being influenced by Satan, moving toward Israel, and it says after that, 2 other woes are yet to come. So here we go. Verse 13, "The 6th angel sounded his trumpet." So we're at the 6th trumpet now. "I heard a voice coming from the horns of the golden altar that is before God." Now the horns are where in the Old Testament, the Jews were to sprinkle blood of a lamb, a perfect lamb, on the altar as part of their seeking forgiveness for their sins, for atonement. But now you have the time for mercy is over, and the horns are crying out. Decisions must be made before it's too late. And now it's as if God's saying, the time has come. Verse 14, it said to the 6th angel who had the trumpet, "Now release the 4 angels who are bound at the great river Euphrates." And this river is a huge river that flows from Turkey through Syria to Iraq. And the 4 angels who had been kept ready for this very hour and day and month and year. So there's a definite purpose for them holding back this army or this time period. They were released. This army's released now to kill 1/3 of mankind, but only when God allows this to take place. Judgment has come. Verse 16, "The number of the mounted troops, there are 200 million people coming against Israel." And John says, "I heard that number." So he knows for a fact that's how many it was. And when it says to kill a third of mankind, and you go back into Revelation 6 and 8, and it talked already about killing a quarter of mankind. So now we're up to 1 billion people of the earth that have been killed during this time period of the last 7 years of tribulation. 1 billion people passing away through judgment. Verse 17, there were horses and riders, and I saw in my vision where they looked like this, and he's still trying to describe it the best he can. Breastplates were fiery red and dark blue, kind of like smoke, and yellow as sulfur, which is an ignited rock or a fire. The heads of the horses resembled, he's trying to explain it, the heads of lions, and out of their mouths came fire. So fire is coming from this army, smoke and sulfur. Verse 18, a third of mankind was killed by the 3 plagues of fire, smoke, and sulfur that came out of their mouths. So God is allowing these plagues to take place through Satan and his armies. The power of the horses was in their mouths and in their tails were like snakes. So this is even worse than the previous scorpions, having heads with which they inflict injury. And I doubt that they're actually scorpions or actual snakes, but this is the vision that John's trying to explain, most likely parts of an army and the tools of an army. The rest of mankind were not killed by these plagues. Still, they did not repent of the work of their hands. They did not stop worshiping demons and idols of gold, silver, bronze, stone, and wood, idols that cannot see or hear or walk. So the world is still worshiping things that they make, not the true God. And verse 21 wraps it up and says, nor did they repent of their murders and their magic arts and sexual immorality and their thefts. At this point in this study, we need to bring in Ezekiel, because he was a prophet that talked about, in the first few chapters of Ezekiel, the leaving of God from the country of Israel. And then later on, he comes back. It talks about a valley of dry bones and Israel coming back to becoming a country again. If you know much about the history, in 1947, after World War II, Israel had nowhere to go, so they came back as a nation, which is unheard of in the world. But here it is being prophesied in Ezekiel chapter 37. And then in chapter 38, it goes on a little further in the future, and it talks about a battle of Gog and Magog. And this battle sounds very similar to the battle that we've been talking about in Joel and in the prophecy of Revelation chapter 9. So let's read a few of these verses and see how they align. And I believe they are talking about a battle that will take place that will shake Israel up, and probably leads to them, the 144,000 that will come to know the Lord as they cry to the Lord, help us, God, from these nations that are coming against us in battle. So in Ezekiel 38, Ezekiel says the word of the Lord came to him. And in verse 3 he says, this is what the sovereign Lord says, I am against you, Gog. And this reference to Gog and Magog is a barbaric type of people that were descendants of Noah in the Old Testament. But more than anything, it is an influenced evil over a people that are coming from the north, likely from Turkey or in Afghanistan, some of those areas, even Russia, these areas that are going to be influenced in the future to make a move against Israel. Verse 4, I will turn you around. I'm going to put hooks in your jaws and bring you out with your whole army, your horses, your horsemen fully armed, a great horde with large and small shields. So they're very well armed. It looked like an army coming towards Israel, all of them brandishing their swords. And it mentions a few of the countries, Persia, Cush, Put, will be with them. All of these shields and helmets, also Gomer with all their troops, and Beth Togarmah, and from the far north, all of these troops. So these many nations are going to be with Gog and Magog in this battle, likely in the first, probably about the 3.5 year point during the tribulation. These are nations that are gathered around Israel. Then it goes on, you and all your troops and the many nations with you will go up, advancing like a storm. Sounds a lot like Revelation 9. You will be like a cloud covering the land. This is what the sovereign Lord says. On the day thoughts will come into your mind, and you will devise an evil scheme. So this is not plans from the Lord to protect a people. This is an evil scheme against God's people. And the Magog armies, this army of the future, this spirit of evil, has devised an evil scheme. And we know who evil schemes come from. This is from Satan himself. Verse 11, you will say, I will invade a land of unwalled villages. I will attack a peaceful and unsuspecting people, all of them living without walls and without gates and bars. Now, this sounds like the Daniel 9 and 27 verse that talks about how in the 7 years of tribulation, in the first part of it, Israel will have a peace treaty with the future Antichrist, or the future person that Satan sets up in place as the future leader of the world. And it will be a false peace, but this peace will last for a while. And Israel, living in peace, all of a sudden this Magog army from many nations up around them will come toward Israel in order to fight them and have their way with Israel. So this battle that's coming will not be a surprise to Israel. They're going to see all of these nations coming against them during this day. It's probably 3.5 years inside of the tribulation period, and they probably have not come to the Lord yet, but now they are crying out to God, help us, because they know they're defeated. They don't have walls around them anymore. They're spread out. They live in peace. And then in this verse it says, this is what will happen on that day. When Gog, these evil enemies of God, of Israel, attack the land of Israel, my hot anger, this is God talking, will be aroused, declares the sovereign Lord. And in my zeal and fiery wrath, I declare that at the time there shall be a great earthquake in the land of Israel, and the earth will tremble at my presence. The mountains are going to be overturned. Continues on in verse 21. I will summon a sword against Gog and on all my mountains, declares the sovereign Lord. Every man's sword will be turned against his brother. So now you've got this army from many nations, and they're fighting one another, so they will wind up killing each other rather than killing Israel, their target. Verse 22, I'm going to execute judgment on this army, on Gog and Magog, and a plague of bloodshed will come upon them. I'll pour down torrents of rain, so the weather will turn terrible on them, and they won't be able to get a foothold. The ground will be muddy and just a quagmire of them trying to fight in it. Hailstones, burning sulfur, falling down on the troops. It will be a miserable day for battle. And this is probably going to be a sudden occasion. They're so angry, wanting to come against Israel, they don't even notice that the weather's turning bad, and then it's going to get so bad that God's wrath is going to be dumped on top of them. So, verse 23, I will show my greatness, God says, and my holiness, and I will make myself known in the sight of many nations. I can imagine the world news showing all over the world, and people will see how the armies that are coming against Israel will fall and will collapse. And then they will know that I am the Lord. So as we come to the conclusion of this chapter 9, and we see that there is 200 million soldiers coming in toward Israel, it just makes good sense that when you look in Ezekiel 38 and 39, that this army from Gog and Magog, from that region, they're so angry at Israel, and then God brings down his wrath on them when Israel has no one else to turn to. Usually when you have nowhere else to go or nowhere else to look but up, that's the time that we repent, when there's nothing else you can do but ask God, I need your help. And I believe this is where Israel will be placed during this war, and God will open up the heavens, and bad weather will fall, hailstones will fall, fire will fall. They will kill each other. They will get stuck in the mud. The earthquake will come, and they will basically be overturned, and the world will look and say, surely they have been protected, because they were going to be wiped out. And in the end of this, in Ezekiel 39, it talks about how after the Lord sends fire on Magog, that they will be no longer, and that on that day, in verse 11 of chapter 39, says, on that day I will give Gog a burial place in Israel, and they will all be buried there, and it instructs that for 7 years that all of the army tools, the devices there that they brought in, it will be used. They won't have to gather any firewood anymore. They'll be able to burn all that plunder. And those that wanted to plunder Israel, now Israel's going to wind up plundering them. They can take what they need to, melt it down, and use it for whatever they need to. So this event is definitely not Armageddon, but it sounds like an event that has never taken place before, but an event that is building up to something that can happen in the very near future. So that's what we're looking at in Revelation 9 as we get to the next chapter, Revelation 10. So join us in the next video. Thank you for listening.